Thank you all very much for coming out, and to everyone who's on Zoom as well for joining this evening's talk about Wichenford's Big Dig. I work for Worcestershire County Council for the Archive and Archaeology Service, but I've also been the project officer for the project behind Wichenford's Big Dig, and so that's why I'm here this evening. If you've not met me before, I'm going to run through a little bit about the project first for anyone who doesn't know about it. And then I'll go through Wichenford's results. I'll go through the test pits individually, and then we'll have a look at kind of the bigger picture that's brought up. Yeah, and if there's any problems on Zoom, do give me a shout if people can't see or anything. So small pits, big ideas too. Apologies, I can't get rid of that bar on the top. So the project is a community archaeology project researching rural medieval Worcestershire. So it's as much a research project as it is a community project to get people involved. The project has been going around 6 places in Worcestershire and holding big digs. So like the one we've had in Wichenford, we've had those in 5 other places around the county too. Those started in autumn 2021. And we finished last summer, and the project's now just coming towards the end, so we're near the end of the project now. Okay. So the project has been looking at the story of our villages, and particularly the villages that we still live in today, because archaeologists have been very good at looking at deserted medieval villages, but the ones that people carried on living in and that weren't deserted are much harder to investigate because, in fact, people still live there are houses there. It makes them much harder to excavate and actually find out more about them. Someone quite sensibly pointed out some years ago that if we've only ever really excavated deserted villages, the story of those villages might not be the same as the ones that people carried on living in, that actually there might be something different going on in the villages we all still live in today, and we should really find out about their story. It's thought in England as a kind of a whole that villages started to appear between the 10th and the 12th century. That's quite a wide generalisation. And what we want to know is that the case in Worcestershire? Is that true, or have we got something a bit different going on? And you know, are the stories of the villages we still live in, you know, do they have a similar story or something different to what happened during the Black Death? Do we see a big impact from the Black Death in the 1340s or not? Because people are still living here, we can't open up really big trenches. The best way to have a look at them is through test pits. So small 1 by 1 metre squares. They're not very big. You can fit them in most gardens, open green spaces, things like that. The idea of digging test pits is that you don't need to find a medieval house in order to know that people were living near that spot in medieval times. Because if you can find their rubbish, you know that they were quite nearby. So unlike today, where our rubbish gets regularly taken away and ends up quite a long way from where we live, nobody came and did that in the past. So your rubbish ends up as far away as you're prepared to take it away yourself, which in a lot of cases was not very far at all. And the first it's likely to end up is on the fields that you farm. So the more pottery we find, pottery in particular, because it's really easy to date, it changes with fashions. If we find medieval pottery, we know that people were living nearby at that date. If we find a lot of medieval pottery, we know that we're pretty near to where people were actually living. So that's kind of the idea behind the test pits. They're nice and easy to fit in gardens. One test pit will give you the story of sort of one site. If you do lots of them across a whole village, you start to get a much bigger picture about that whole settlement and what was going on. And then if you do this across the whole region, as they've done in East Anglia, you start to get an even bigger story about things like Black Death in particular. The impact of that has shown up quite strongly in East Anglia. And that's fascinating, but what I would like to know is what's going on in Worcestershire and the West Midlands. Have we got a similar story, or have we got different things going on here? That's kind of the ideas behind all of our big digs, is to kind of start building up a picture, a bit like they've got in East Anglia. So on to Wichenford itself. I just want to give you a little bit of the kind of key history that we already know about the parish. Obviously not going to go into too much detail, and there's people around who know far more than I do. But there are descriptions from the 8th century onwards of the parish boundaries for Wichenford. So we know that there was a place here, from the 8th century at least onwards. Quite unusually, it's not recorded in the Domesday survey in 1086, which was done just after the Norman Conquest. This is probably because the land that the parish in Wichenford was owned by the Bishop of Worcester, part of his estate at Wick. So it probably got rolled into that. But there is mention in 1095 the church being here. So there's definitely a village. And interestingly, in Wichenford, you have a massive number of medieval moated sites. I think there's about 7. Most parishes don't have one. So that's quite unusual. And there's obviously lots known, because the parish was owned by the Bishop of Worcester for a lot of its history. There's really well documented records of what was going on. I know the Wichenford Local Heritage Group have done a massive amount, very impressive research. What we want to know is, what can archaeology add to that and tell us things that we didn't already know about the village. So last April, we had the big dig. There were 20 test pits right across the full sort of length of the parish, and about 100 people took part in total. So we had North Worcestershire Archaeological Group came and helped, and the Worcestershire Young Archaeologists Club were involved too. So a lot of people came and took part, and it was a very great weekend. And I think something I wanted to point out on this slide as well is Wichenford, as I'm sure a lot of you who live locally are aware, has quite heavy clay as the underlying geology. And the soil here is also very heavy clay as a result, which made Wichenford's dig a bit more of a challenge than in other places. So a lot of Worcestershire is on heavy clay. That's not unique, but we did find that it was particularly heavy clay here. So the photograph you can see on the right-hand slide at the bottom of someone sieving, that got given up quite quickly. You can't really sieve the soil here, which is what we have done in some places to look for finds. That's just something to bear in mind as we go through, that there were some challenges with this. So this is a map of all the test pits across the parish. So Wichenford is shown that kind of green, slightly Pac-Man-like shape, and all the red blobs are test pit locations. So as you'll see, they were spread out across the full sort of couple of miles spread north to south of the parish. So yeah, a good mix. So go through the test pits individually now. There are 20, so apologies for the kind of brief nature of going through them individually. But we'll go from north to south. So start at test pit 1, which was at Orchard Cottage. This test pit was in the garden of a house that is first mentioned in the late 17th century. There's a written record to it in 1692, and that mentions being an earlier house on that plot. So we're interested to know if we found any signs of that earlier building. We had an awful lot of finds that date from the 17th century onwards, including quite a nice slate pencil, which is on the slide and you can see at the back as well. This test pit didn't quite get down to the natural geology. So that's the point at which archaeology stops happening. So the soil no longer has human artifacts in it, and the kind of undisturbed geology starts. So that's the point at which we hoped all the test pits would reach, because then we knew we wouldn't have missed any earlier archaeology. This test pit didn't quite get to that point, but probably wasn't too far off. We didn't find any evidence of an earlier building. That 17th century date fits in very nicely with the written record of that cottage being there. But although we didn't quite get to the bottom of that test pit, I think given how heavily worked over gardens tend to be, I think if there was lots of earlier evidence, if there'd been a much earlier house right on that site, I think we would have found some hints of it, just given kind of that gardens do tend to get quite turned up, and earlier finds should have probably been brought a little bit higher up. Test pits 2 and 3 were at Cockshoots Farm, kind of neighbouring properties. Cockshoots is a name that has very old origins. It certainly appears from the 13th century onwards. The site is thought to have been moated, and there's been some previous archaeological work on the site that supports that. The current farmhouse as it stands is thought to be 17th century though, so the kind of present buildings are a little bit later than that medieval origin. The 2 test pits here both produced finds from the late 17th century onwards. Test pit 3, which was at the grain house, that's a converted barn next to the main farmhouse, produced quite a few more finds than the other one. Interestingly there, we had some slightly earlier building materials. So we had bits of roof tile that date from the late 15th to 17th century. There are definitely hints of earlier buildings that probably predate the standing ones that were found in those test pits. Also had quite a nice clay pipe stem, which is from the late 17th century, which has the maker's stamp on it, which is quite unusual to find. It's on the slide at the bottom, but I know it's a bit hard to see. It's an 8-spoked wheel in a circle, and that's a stamp that comes from the West Country, possibly around the Exeter area. And that's just quite a nice thing to be able to kind of province so closely there. The test pit 2, which was in the garden of Cockshoot Farm itself, we were a little bit unlucky with where it was placed, because we hit a layer of kind of landscaped work, so not very far under the topsoil. The ground being quite churned up, and I think there's probably been some landscaping of the garden that has happened at some point, which is a little bit unfortunate because the flower bed suggested there was a lot more to be found that was sticking out, but that's the way it goes sometimes. So definitely hints of some earlier buildings there, but surprisingly we really thought there might be medieval finds in these 2 test pits, and there wasn't, which is a little bit of a surprise. Test pits 4 to 6 were in the main part of Wichenford village as it is today. The test pit 4, which was at Orchard View, was placed there because the field adjacent to it, because the house itself is modern, but the field next to Orchard View is recorded as having been the site of Widow Knowles' house. And the record of that, which comes from 1745, has a note next to it saying that it was in the family for time out of mind, which is quite a poetic turn of phrase, but suggests that that cottage itself was very, very old and had certainly been around for several hundred years by the time that was written in 1745. So test pit 4 went in kind of as close to that site as possible, and that did really pay off. This test pit produced our first medieval finds. First bit being this, which I know looks really grotty, but is quite exciting, I promise you. Sometimes the most exciting things don't visually look the most exciting. This is a bit of medieval cooking pot. Really helpfully, it's the rim of the cooking pot, which means it's much easier to date. And this one probably made around in the Malvern area between 1220 and 1300. So quite early on in the medieval period. There were 2 other bits of medieval pottery found in this test pit as well. Unfortunately, they weren't the top of a pot, so they are harder to date quite as precisely. They had a much broader date range, but were probably medieval as well. So definitely hints of medieval settlement in this area. They are quite worn though. This is a pot that has moved around in the ground quite a lot since someone dropped it and threw it away. Test pits 5 and 6, which were at port numbers 4 and 10 Malvern View. Those have both been placed in those gardens, again, of more modern houses, but because on the 19th century, early 19th century maps, there are houses shown in those locations. So it's thought that there were earlier buildings to be found. Both test pits there produced 19th to 20th century finds. So nothing earlier than that, other than a little bit of late 18th century pottery. We've got some extra writing there. So those two test pits, finds from them, they do broadly fit with the historic mapping, sort of just slightly pre-Victorian houses. Those two didn't reach the bottom of the kind of the archaeological sequence though. So it is possible that there is a little bit more to be found. But again, as I said earlier, I think given that they're gardens and they're areas that may have been ploughed previously, I think if those houses were considerably older, we should have found some hints of that. Test pit 7 was at the old vicarage, so just south of where we are now, opposite the church. There's record of a vicarage being on the site opposite the church from the 16th century onwards. There may have been earlier vicarages, but that's the first mention of one. The current vicarage as it stands was built in the 1830s, but we know there's been some suggestion that the older building, the old vicarage, was sort of in the northwest corner of the site, which is where we placed test pit 7. This test pit produced quite a lot of finds, an interesting selection of kind of household rubbish. So there were bits of lots of animal bones, butchery waste from the kitchen. The drawing on at the top is quite a big cattle bone from the ankle. So someone probably, maybe not quite a feast, but someone had an interesting tasty meal at some point. There was some bits of Staffordshire slipware pottery, which is always quite jolly to see. So the bit at the bottom right, yellow and brown, often striped or slightly sort of feather patterns. Most of it's made in Staffordshire. And those are they're slightly earlier than you might expect some of those. They're made sort of late 17th into the 18th century. So kind of, yeah, good age those. There was also a lot of 18th and 19th century pottery. We had quite a nice bit of a glass perfume bottle as well. So an interesting selection of finds. Again, at this test pit, we might have expected to see perhaps some earlier hints here. There is record, as I said at the beginning, of the vicarage being there in the 16th century. We didn't really have any 16th century finds from this test pit. This might be that we just didn't get far enough in this test pit. I do think there was probably a little bit further to excavate. But yeah, there's a bit of a theme you'll notice emerging here, which we'll come to at the end. Yeah, 17th, 18th century finds and not much earlier. So test pits 8 and 9 are over by Newhouse, up by King's Green area. So these two test pits were both on sites that have record of buildings being there from the 1600s. Neither of those two buildings that there are written records of still stands. Test pit 8 is in an area that's currently at the end of an orchard, and it's a raised sort of flat level area that looks like a classic, what we call a house platform. So an area that someone has deliberately flattened at some point in the past to put a house on. That test pit produced, I think, the second highest quantity of finds. It produced quite a lot of finds. And the earliest of those was quite a nice little mug handle, which is on the table at the back if you want to have a look afterwards. But that's a style that was most common in the 16th century. So some quite nice, slightly earlier finds. Interestingly, at test pit 8, there's almost nothing that post-dates 1800. The finds there seem to stop, and actually it looks like that cottage that was there the quantity of finds suggests there definitely was a building on that site. That went out of use or was demolished and knocked down around 1800. Is kind of the date the pottery suggests. And I think that test pit probably did get to the bottom. So I don't think there's much earlier that'd be missing, unless that leveled area, someone has really built it up and there's kind of there's earlier stuff kind of trapped under kind of a big layer of kind of leveling material. But certainly that cottage or house as it stood, I think looks like it was there perhaps 1600s to 1800. Test pit 9 was in the garden of New House itself. So New House, kind of as the name suggests, is the second house on that site. The earlier one disappeared at some point. We're not quite sure when, but New House was built in sort of the earlier part of the 19th century around a barn from the older house that had been there. This test pit produced quite a few 17th to 19th century finds. So a slightly later date range than test pit 8. A really lovely find from this test pit as part of a brick, which is interesting for two reasons. One is that it is a little bit earlier. It's sort of it's a brick that predates New House as it stands. It was a handmade brick made between sort of 1500 and 1700. But what's really lovely about it is that it's got some finger impressions on it. Don't know how well this will show up in the photograph, but I'll try and show you. So this is looking at the top of the brick, and someone has put their hands on it, and you can see two fingers. So it's not just a fingerprint, it is kind of a couple of knuckles like a finger. Circled in red there. So someone has put their fingers on this when they're damp. They're quite small fingers. Someone, a slender adult, may have picked this brick up when it was damp. It's possible though this is a child that's picked this up. I think that's just a wonderful kind of very personal connection to someone in the past. Was this a child who was just being curious and a bit naughty and got told off for moving things that were damp? Or is this a child who was actually working because of kind of the realities of the times? So we're not going to know, but it's one of those objects that if it could talk, I would love to hear what story it's got behind it. So test pits 10 and 11, and moving down the road a little bit to Colcott's Farm and Arundel's Farm. So test pit 10, which is at Colcott's Farm. This site is another of the moated farmhouses in Wichenford. So it's thought to have medieval origins. The house as it stands has been rebuilt, but before that there was a timber framed building, which you can see in the bottom corner. That was thought to date from the 1660s, but had sandstone foundations, which suggested that there may have been medieval origins in a previous incarnation of that farmhouse. So again, another very old site in the village. This test pit found some quite heavily disturbed ground and came across a land drain as well. This one had quite a lot of 18th century and 19th century finds onwards, but they did run out of time in this test pit. So there is definitely more archaeology to be found there. But as you might expect, as a site that has had quite a few rebuildings going on, I think the ground has been quite heavily disturbed on that site. Arundel's Farm, which is just down the road, has a 15th century barn on the site, but the name Arundel's appears quite early on in written records. So it has been suggested that the site may be quite a lot older, although whether there are any buildings on the site is open to be found out. Finds from this test pit were all quite definitively from the mid to late 18th century onwards. Now this test pit did hit the natural ground underneath. It found the nice, quite bright orange clay that I'm sure some of you have seen in your gardens. I think the ground here has probably been truncated at some point, with someone levelling the ground as part of landscaping work or bits of building work. But some of the bits we did have are some metalworking waste, which is not uncommon to find, particularly in rural areas where people used it as kind of hardcore, sometimes got sold off. And we also found some bits, you can see in the top corner, there's some white bits of white discs. These are from Worcester porcelain works, and they were used as spacers to separate out things that were being fired, so that when they went in the kiln that they didn't touch each other. These again were sometimes sold off as hardcore, but it's interesting to find them here and see how far across Worcestershire they spread. That's kind of quite a nice local thing to find. Test bits 12 to 14 were all along Ben Lane, just sort of going a little bit west to the test bits. First one, test bit 12, it's a site known as the Beacons, which is now just a field, but historic maps show that there was a house standing on this plot. It's first mentioned in 1577, so quite an old reference. And we know it disappears between two of the maps that are made. So at some point around the turn of the 19th century, it seems to have disappeared. This test pit was kind of located quite carefully to try and get somewhere near where these buildings had once stood. And it seems to have been in a pretty good place. Interestingly, we didn't have too much in the way of pottery and of kind of other household rubbish. We did have a little bit, which was all from the 17th to the 19th century. What we did have quite a lot of was building rubble. So this very firmly supports all the map evidence that definitely were buildings on this site in the past. Building material all appears to be that sort of late 15th to 17th century, so quite early. They're all handmade bricks, and one of them, which is the photograph at the bottom, has got straw impressions on the bottom. It's quite, just again, a quite less personal than the fingerprints, but quite nice to see. Actually, this is what someone sat this down on some straw to dry before it ended up being built, probably on that site as one of the buildings there. There was a little bit more to reach in this test pit that we didn't get to, but it might not have been too far off the bottom. And this is clearly a site that's had some demolition or been left to fall down at some point. And I think if there was lots of much earlier archaeology predating the 17th century, I think we probably would see it. But yeah, and it's perhaps a site to find out a little bit more about in the future. Test pit 13 was at the site next door at Little Acre, which is probably, I think, one of the oldest standing buildings in the parish. It's timber framed cottage inside. It's mentioned in the 1400s as having repairs to it. So presumably there was something there pre that. And yeah, quite curiously, all the finds from here date in a really tight date range from the mid to late 18th century. Now, this is really surprising. A, because there's a medieval timber frame building standing right next to it. This test pit was put quite close to the house, and we would expect to see some of those finds, particularly as I think one of the early references to the house for someone having had the dung heaps and rubbish heaps right up against the building walls and that causing a problem. So people clearly threw their rubbish away somewhere into this house. And it's curious that we haven't found any of it. It's possible this test pit just didn't go deep enough, but gardens tend to be quite heavily worked over. And it's quite curious that there's such a kind of tight date range of finds. And there's nothing later, there's nothing earlier in there that suggests people have been digging up the ground and churning things up. So something a little bit curious going on there, I think, with what people have done with the land around this house at different points. it might be that in the 18th century, someone perhaps leveled the ground there. There was a little bit of rubbish thrown away, and then after that, people have been very good about keeping it as a nice garden. There must be some earlier finds near that house, so that is quite a curious one. Test pit 14 was down the road at a site known as the Sims. So like Deacon's, this is a site that historic maps show a house being there, but it doesn't stand today. The finds we had from here weren't huge in number, but they were all 18th and 19th century. So could well date from that house being there. It is opposite Bury End Town Farm, though, so some of these finds probably travelled across the road. It's possible, looking at the historic maps, that this test pit was a little bit too far north of the houses, the house that once stood on that site. It obviously is part of the working farm and the fields around there, so there were some limitations as to where we can go. But again, this is a curious one that there isn't anything before the 18th century. Test pit 15. On slight rise, is Abingdon's cottage, so near to all the others that we've just looked at. So this is one where not so much is known about the house that currently stands there. So Abingdon's itself is a very old land holding in Wichenford. There's historic records of it going back a very long way, but there's not very many references to this site in particular. So it's been speculated as to whether there was quite an early house on this site, but it's not really known. The current house possibly converted agricultural buildings. This test pit produced quite a lot of interesting range of finds, and also we think produced one of the oldest finds we've had from across the dig, which is a piece of Roman pottery. I'm afraid I haven't photographed this for you, as it looks a little bit disappointing, but it is at the back if you'd like to see it. There have been other Roman finds around Abingdon's cottage, and there clearly is some Roman activity in that area. The bit of pottery found has clearly been in plough soil for quite a long time, and has been churned up and disturbed for quite a long time. But there definitely is something going on in this area for quite a long time. And you can probably see why. It's on quite a nice little rise, and the landscape does look like quite a good spot to be. Alongside a bit of Roman pottery, there's also a little bit of metalworking waste. And like the metalworking waste that we've found little bits of in other test pits, that's all been smithing waste from people working metal and shaping it into objects. The metalworking waste we have from Abingdon's cottage is from smelting, so it's from actually taking the ore and making it into metal, and it's a very heavy bit of waste, which tells us that there's still quite a bit of the ore, a bit of the metal left in there, and that comes from the processes that were used during Roman times and medieval times. This isn't to say this is necessarily going on the site. It is quite a small piece, but somewhere in the vicinity or some site that this place had contact with was producing metal. So I think that's quite an intriguing piece to find, and a quite early date for that. But again, a little bit frustrating that because technology stayed the same for such a long time, it's quite hard to precisely date it. It's got a very broad date range. The medieval period, Roman to medieval, is the better part of 1600 years that could come from, and it could come from kind of any century within that. But nevertheless, still quite an interesting thing to find. After that, there's then a piece of medieval pottery. So we definitely have some medieval activity in this area. Unfortunately, it's not the top of a pot, and has a very broad date range from the 13th, 15th century. But it is some of the stuff that's made around Malvern, and is almost certainly medieval in date. So there is some medieval activity up in that area. After those few early pieces, the majority of the finds from this test pit came from the 18th to 19th century. There are a couple of quite curious pieces. There's a little part of a spout, apparently, that's a head of a person wearing a turban. The finds archaeologist who looked at it has no idea quite what it is. They put a lot of question marks next to it. It's something quite curious. Yeah, if it's part of a spout, presumably not just a figurine. There's also a very tiny porcelain cup, which we've got the base of, which you can see for scale in the drawing on the left at the top. This was a really tiny cup, and it's been suggested that it probably was a doll's set. It is so tiny, which is just quite a sweet thing to find. You very rarely see evidence of children in the past, because until Victorian times, a lot of toys were handmade things or were imaginary games and things that are not going to survive in the archaeological record. So it's quite a nice thing to actually find, remind us there were lots of children who lived in Wichenford in the past, even if we don't really see them. Test bit 16 and 17, moving a little bit further south to Cobb House and to Little Cobb House. So starting at test bit 16, which was at Cobb House, and there's a photograph again of Cobb House at the top. This is the third of the medieval moated sites that we investigated during the Big Dig. The house, as it stands, is thought to be date from the 16th century with some later additions, but there probably was a moat on that site, so that implies that there are some medieval origins to this site. All the finds we had here date from the mid-18th century onwards. There was nothing earlier. There were also all the finds from there were very small and quite worn bits, and that strongly suggests that they're finds that someone has thrown onto a midden, which is a rubbish heap that tends to get worked over, often spread over fields. That's ultimately where it ended up. And that's sometimes why, particularly pottery, you see that's happened to it. It ends up being quite stone-like and rolled around, the edges get kind of smoothed. So it looks like we found an 18th century midden. Again, we don't really have anything earlier, which is quite curious. Possible that test bit didn't quite get to the bottom. But the question still stands, probably should have been hints of something earlier. Little Cobb House, it was connected originally to the farmhouse, and there's references to it being a new build or recently built in 1765. So it seems to come from that time, but whether there's anything earlier, it's not really known. Finds we had from that test pit do support that actually that written reference probably is the first house in that site. We had finds from the later 18th century onwards, and a couple of interesting bits of porcelain. So the photograph on the bottom is part of a porcelain plate, I think, which has an orange splodge on it, which is quite unusual. And the suggestion from Rob Hedge, who did all the finds analysis, is that this might be a second that was sold off by the factory, and that they were perhaps doing glaze testing. And actually this is just someone trying out different coloured glazes and then selling off the plates to people nearby who are happy to have slightly odd looking but cheaper porcelain plates. Test bit 18 was down the road at Wood End Farm, which is the fourth and the last of the medieval moated sites we looked at. This site is a little bit different to the other three looked at in that part of the moat does still survive and it does still have water in it. You can see it. It's still quite deep. It's the farmhouse, again, it's part timber framed, and tree ring dating, so some dendrochronology of the farmhouse has produced dates from 1514, so some quite early dates for a standing building. This test pit found another little bit of Roman pottery. It's locally made style called Severn Valley ware, so it's the most common type of Roman pottery we find in Worcestershire, and as the name suggests, it was made kind of all up the Severn Valley. Possibly came from something a bit like that grey jar on the side. It's quite a small bit again. There is some artistic license as to whether it was a jar or a different kind of form. The majority of the finds we had after that date from the late 18th century. There is, though, quite a curious find, which is photographed at the bottom, which appears to be a floor tile that's been reused at some point. The floor tile itself, though, is medieval or very sort of early in the centuries after, so probably made between 1200 and 1600. And at that date, you don't expect to see floor tiles in normal domestic buildings. You almost exclusively find them in ecclesiastical buildings. This is quite an unusual thing to find kind of outside that context. It may be that farmhouse at Wood End was quite grand when it was first built. They perhaps were buying some sort of second-hand floor tiles from somewhere else. It might just be that it's come from somewhere else and was sort of just reused as a bit of handy building material. But it is quite an odd thing to find that we wouldn't expect to see. Even on you don't normally expect to see these things kind of outside religious buildings. Last thing to say though about this test pit is I think this test pit did have a little bit more to go. At the time it was thought it had reached the natural geology, and I think looking back, given it was quite difficult conditions over the weekend, I think there probably was a little bit more to go on this site. And then the last few test bits to finish off quite a whirlwind trip. We're at Lingon's Cottage and Lingon's Farm. So test bit 19 at Lingon's Cottage produced a lot of 19th century finds, including quite a good selection of glass bottles, including some quite nice whole kind of paste jars. It's Lingon's Cottage, the building that stands, appears on the 1886 Ordnance Survey, so it definitely dates from at least that time. The site itself, though, appears in references much earlier on, and it's possible that there was a house on that site much earlier. The finds that we had don't suggest that there was anything much earlier. There is a little bit of particularly brick and tile that predates 1800. I think, though, given they're all quite small bits that are all quite worn and kind of rolled around in the ground, I think these have probably all come from manure being spread over fields and little bits of rubbish ending up in them. That's how they're on this site, rather than suggesting that there was definitely a building before the cottage that currently stands. I think if there was an earlier one, there would be a lot more to find. Test bit 20 was then over at Lingon's Farm. Farm, for a lot of its history, was known as Lillings and has a very, very old history. And the names mentioned very early medieval period, and there's a house mentioned on the site, I think from the 15th century. There's definitely been a long history on this site. This test pit, I think, produced the most finds out of any of them. The reason for that being that they hit a dump of 18th century rubbish that has not moved anywhere else. So unlike pretty much everything else we've found on the dig, the stuff we've tended to find has been thrown away in one place and has gradually over time been rolled around a bit and moved, maybe not very far at all, maybe just within, a few feet within a garden, but it has been worked over. This stuff has been thrown away and then no one has disturbed it since then. There's some very large pieces of, particularly of this, which is called a panchion, very wide flared bowls, often used for bread making or for separating cream. They're made between about 1700 and 1800. There's some very large bits in comparison to all the other pottery found in the test bits, particularly that big bit at the top is incredibly large. It's sort of about 20 centimeters across. And what's quite nice is you can actually start to piece together some of the bits that were thrown away. There's quite a similar coloured, quite large mug, and some other bits and pieces you can have a look at the back. But because there's so many bits of pot that have been thrown away, there's quite a tight date range, about 50 years that we've been able to give to this, between about 1720 and 1770. So some point within those few decades, which is not often something you can pin down. People at that farmhouse were dumping all their rubbish just out the back of the farmhouse. It's actually not very far. I think I would have probably wanted to get a little bit further with my rubbish. But maybe the front door was in a different place then. But that's quite an interesting one to see, because you don't get that very often. Often in gardens, the archaeology is really quite disturbed. So this is quite a nice thing to find. Because of that, though, this test pit was deeper than a lot of the others that we dug over the weekend. So this test pit didn't get down quite to the bottom. It is possible there were some earlier bits to find there. And test pits 19 and 20 both also produced 2 coins. So coincidentally, they were next to each other, or maybe there's no coincidence at all. These are both Georgian counterfeit coins. Now you can have a look at them at the back. They're very worn and they look like flat discs of metal. Quite sort of fortuitously, we had Murray Andrews, who is a coin specialist, taking part in Wichenford's Big Dig. He took one look at them and instantly went, oh yes, they're Georgian counterfeit coins, they were half pennies, which I'm eternally amazed by. I struggled to make out anything on either side of either coin. The best face has been illustrated on the slide there, and you can just on one of them just about make out bust of a king. These, though, by all accounts, are quite obvious counterfeits. They hadn't tried too hard to copy the real thing. They were probably made in Birmingham, which appears to have been kind of the centre of the Georgian counterfeit trade. They seem to have drawn on the local button making industry. Someone clearly had the thought, the button industry is making lots of metal discs, probably some with decoration on. Coins are metal discs with some decoration on, and perhaps let's put some of those techniques together. So during the Georgian period, real coins, particularly the bronze ones, started being quite short supply because there just weren't enough of them around. And particularly when the Industrial Revolution started, in towns, there was more demand for wages being paid, and they just hadn't made enough of the real thing. Probably quite a big impetus behind people starting to make fake ones. They just couldn't get hold of the real thing. Estimates from the time suggest that by the 1750s, about a quarter to a half of the bronze coins in circulation were fake ones. This wasn't rare. These were quite plenty. But it's quite interesting to have found them in a rural area, because a lot of the coin studies that happen that can be from urban areas and from big excavations in towns. So having them from a village is quite interesting to find. I also wonder if the people who these hands passed, if they knew they were counterfeit, or they just had no idea. They were just kind of saw them so often that they didn't think twice about it. as you might expect, the authorities at the time did try and ban this. They were well aware of it happening and weren't happy about it. There's records of the Mayor of Worcester declaring that tradespeople in the town couldn't accept counterfeit coins from people trying to buy goods. Clearly didn't work very well because it was reissued several times, that message. So yeah, I think people had coins and someone was willing to accept them as payments. I think they probably passed as the real thing. Just want to say at this point, huge thank you to everyone who took part in the fines processing after the dig. So a lot happened over the big dig weekend itself, but archaeology is as much about finds and what goes on afterwards as it is about digging it out the ground. It takes a long time to wash everything, to kind of carefully bag it and mark it and label it, so that then a finds archaeologist can have a look and identify and date it. It wouldn't be possible to do all of that without having first been washed, so we can see what it all is. So thank you to everyone who was involved in that. I want to have a quick look now at, having whizzed through all of the 20 test bits, putting that information all together. We look then at the medieval period in Wichenford. I've highlighted the test bits that produced medieval finds. So on the map, all the test bits are shown in red, and the test bits that had medieval finds are marked in black. So as you can see, there's not a huge number of black dots. There's 4 little ones and 1 slightly larger black dot. So the smaller black dots all produced 1 medieval find. The slightly larger one, which is at test pit 4, produced 3. So across 20 test pits, this is not a huge number. The only one as well that dates to the early medieval period is from test pit 4. So that bit of that rim of a medieval cooking pot, the really quite grossy looking one, that dates in the 13th century. Nothing else that we found could be that precisely dated, or if it was, it dates a bit later. Also worth pointing out, actually, that the 2 test pits towards the bottom that had medieval finds, test pits 18 and 19 at bottom, that wasn't pottery, that was brick or tile that they found that fits in that date range. So it's quite a small quantity. The question this all raises is, where has all the medieval pottery gone? We would expect in somewhere like Wichenford, which has such a well-documented history of medieval occupation, to find, if not a lot, at least a fair amount of medieval pottery. It's thought that across Wichenford, the medieval settlement was probably quite scattered. So as the village is today and across the parish, a lot of houses are kind of, there's clusters here and there, just a few houses and then kind of quite big gaps. That was probably the case in the medieval period. Certainly the moated sites suggest that. But it has been suggested from various different sources that around the Ben Lane, there may have been a small cluster of slightly more nucleated settlement with kind of a few more houses together. So that was where we had test pits 12 to 14. So those ones we would expect to probably have a bit more medieval pottery if there've been kind of more houses in that area. There is most definitely something really peculiar going on in Wichenford in the medieval period. There's a couple of suggestions to this, particularly for the moated sites. There are moated sites sort of in this part of Worcestershire, ones that have not had houses on them now. They've been excavated by archaeologists and found to have relatively little in them, with no signs of building, no rubbish, nothing like that. Now, we tend to think of moats as containing quite a grand farmhouse or perhaps a manor house during the medieval period. It is possible that some of the moated sites were perhaps built more as things like sort of stock enclosures, and actually perhaps they had other uses and that people weren't living there. So although we looked at 4 what seemed to be medieval moated sites, and they all had later timber frame buildings on them. It is possible that the moat is medieval, but there weren't any buildings on that site till 15th, 16th, 17th century. That would only explain, though, the moated sites. There are a number of other sites that we looked at that are thought to have medieval origins, or in the case of places like Little Acre, where there is actually a standing part of a medieval building, we would expect to find some of that. The two kind of other suggestions for that is one that we have just missed at all. The geology is trickier in Wichenford. Quite heavy clay makes it harder to tell when you get to the natural geology, because the soil can sometimes look a little bit like you're there because it's such thick clay. And some of the test bits did run out of time. So it's possible we've just missed it all, we didn't get deep enough. And I think that quite well could be the case in some test bits. But 20 is a reasonable sample, and I think it's really unlikely that in 20 cases that's happened. The last suggestion for this is that there are perhaps different farming practices and sort of ways that people were getting rid of their rubbish in Wichenford than we see elsewhere. I think this is probably the more likely, the more interesting explanation that is definitely worth looking into more in the future. What we found on other big digs is that where people seem to have been living, people threw their rubbish quite nearby. We would expect that by medieval houses, you have medieval rubbish. In medieval Wichenford, I think maybe they were throwing it all in their fields and not by their houses. The reason for this, there could be multiple reasons for this. It might be that people were being particularly tidy. It might be that because of the soils here, the land was being managed in a particular way that meant they wanted to keep certain rubbish in certain places. In the medieval period, they had lots of different ideas, their own ideas about how to manage the land and how to look after it. And a lot of that was based around the idea of the four humours, which they also related to the body and to kind of human health. But that kind of looks at whether things are hot and dry or kind of wet and cold, and that sort of four quadrants of it. And it might be that actually there was quite a distinct practices for managing the land here that meant people kept their rubbish in particular places. And I think what kind of supports this idea a little bit is that at the end of the big dig weekend, someone brought into us some finds that had been picked up in a space of, I gather, about 10 minutes from having walked across one of the fields nearby test bit 12 at Bury End Town Farm. There was more medieval pottery there than we've had from the 20 test bits, and considerably larger pieces. And I think that's quite an intriguing thing, intriguing comparison between those two. Actually, in Wichenford, is all the medieval pottery just on the fields and nowhere near the houses? And I think that would be something that would be quite interesting to find out, because that's not something that we appear to see elsewhere, at least from the big digs we've done so far. So unusual but very interesting for it, which I know can seem disappointing, the lack of something, but the lack of it is very interesting because it's so unexpected. Just to look a little bit more at whether it's due to kind of the way the big dig happened. This is a map of the test pits that reach the bottom of the archaeological sequence. So the ones in black are ones that definitely did. The ones in grey probably did, but may or may not have done. And the ones in red definitely didn't. So as you can see, we did have quite a spread of there's a reasonable number that didn't hit the bottom, and quite a few that we're not 100% sure about. And I think that does say something about the geology here and the difficult excavation conditions. And just purely for the fact that everyone who took part in the excavation side, I'm sure will well remember, clay is really hard to dig through. And everyone did incredibly well over 2 days. but sometimes there is limitations as to how much you can get through in 2 days. Just to compare this to the known sort of historic record, so I'll bring up in a minute sort of one at a time, and the sort of earliest sort of definite evidence for buildings being on that site and that we know about in comparison. So if you bear in mind the medieval finds that we found earlier, look at this. So right in the middle of the parish, the two sort of oldest sites we have from sort of 15th century, which is still standing, Little Acre and Arundel's. By the 16th century, 16th, 17th century, but probably with medieval origins suggested, there's quite a few more sites. And 4 of those, the ones with squares around them, are thought to have been moated. So if it didn't have a house there in medieval times, there probably was something there. Then 16th, moving into the 17th century, there's a few more sites here, particularly in the middle of the village. 17th to 18th century, we get a few more houses, particularly at the north end. 18th, moving into the 18th century, and then the 19th at the bottom. So that's quite a steady growth throughout that period. Obviously, this is just a sample. This is not all the houses in the parish. But this isn't a picture that is necessarily being mapped by the archaeology. The vast majority of the finds come from the 18th century onwards. Part of that will be due to the fact that from the 18th century, pottery became a lot more affordable and people just owned more of it. It was a bit cheaper and there's more of it around. So we've found elsewhere that there is more pottery from the 18th century. That's not unusual. But why there is so little before that date is a little bit of a mystery. So just to look at some of the other big digs as well. So I've already mentioned about medieval pottery. What Wichenford has in common though with our other big dig sites is that we don't have any of the very, very early medieval pottery. There's nothing predating the 12th or 13th century. This has been the case and pretty much everywhere across our big digs. We've had 6 of those big digs and we've dug 96 test pits across Worcestershire. So this is not a tiny sample size. This is starting to get a respectable number. The earliest find we've had from those 96 test pits is this bit of pottery down in the bottom corner, which is from White Ladies Aston, just east of Worcester. That comes from the late 11th to mid 12th century, so around the time of the Norman conquest. And that's the earliest we've found. There is nothing earlier, despite the fact all of these places have documented references to being there before that date. What this is starting to tell us is that actually in Worcestershire, people don't seem to be using pottery for cooking and in their household before that date. We do see pottery sometimes in burials. If we find it anywhere, that's where it turns up. But it is vanishingly rare to get pottery before the 11th century in Worcestershire in general. We see it a little bit in some of the towns, but in rural areas, we just don't seem to see it. And actually, I think that's telling us something really interesting, because in East Anglia, where they've done a lot of test fitting, they do get pottery from sort of the 8th, 9th century, 10th century. They can see that very early phase of villages forming. We can't see it, unfortunately, through pottery and through test pits in Worcestershire. But I think there's probably a cultural shift going on, because why do people go from using pottery predominantly in burials, and then by sort of 1250 people are using cooking pots all the time, ceramic ones in their kitchen? That's mostly what we see is cooking pots. People could be using cooking pots, ceramic cooking pots, before that date if they wanted to. They're either choosing not to though, or they can't get hold of them. And I think that's quite an interesting story to find out, that there seems to be quite a shift going on in how people want to use their pots and what they think pots can be used for. And one of the last things I just want to have a look at from Wichenford is a bit more of a local connection with the Worcester porcelain works. We have found quite a lot across Wichenford of bits of porcelain, bits that might have been seconds, so some of that kind of blotchy orange kind of splodged pieces which might have been seconds. We've got quite a few bits of those spacers and some bits of saga, which are big ceramic drums they put stuff in to protect them from the soot whilst they're firing them. We have a lot in Wichenford, and interestingly, as a comparison, in Wolverley, which is right in the very north corner of the parish of the county, we found almost none there. And I think actually we're just a lot closer to Worcester and Worcester porcelain works here, and you can really see that local connection in the finds. So Worcestershire's story is not the same across all of our big digs. There's definitely different things coming out in different places. The last one, just to show you, is quite a nice stamped piece from Lincoln's Cottage, which very handily has broken off just so we can count the number of dots on the bottom, which tells you that it was made in 1926. So just quite like the fact that that's probably never travelled further than Wichenford in its whole life of being an object and being used. So I've realised that was quite a whirlwind trip. If you would like to know more, there will be a report coming out probably around the end of March with a lot more detail about all of the test pits and kind of the results overall. If you took part in the big dig or you hosted a test pit, we'll email the link directly to you, so you'll get that. If not, you're welcome to let me know at the end, and so we can email it to you, or you can have a look on our website. It will be going on explorethepaths.co.uk, is our website, and you'll find small pits listed under the projects. So it'll appear there. There's also currently an exhibition underway, which is at Redditch Library till the 5th of March, and then it's going to the Hive in Worcester. The exhibition combines all of the 6 big digs together and has a look at the story overall, and has some artwork that's been created by groups inspired by the finds. So that's definitely worth a look if you're interested. And just a bit of a sneak peek, this is past the exhibition in the art cabinet being created. Last thing I would say is an enormous thank you to everyone who has taken part in the dig some way, whether you came along and dug for the weekend, you washed finds, you took photographs, you came and helped deturf beforehand, or whatever else you did. This wouldn't have happened without you. So thank you for making it possible. I want to say a special thank you as well to Heather Rendell and to all of Wichenford Local Heritage Group for all your infectious enthusiasm, incredible knowledge and support along the way for making this happen. North Worcestershire Archaeology Group helped enormously with deturfing and some of the logistics beforehand. We're incredibly grateful to you, and to our 2 photographers who took photographs over the weekend as well. So Peter and Julie who helped with that. The finds processing was supervised by Ken MacDonald as well. So there was an awful lot of people involved who made it happen. Hopefully some of you can perhaps see yourself on the slide. And just want to finish and leave you with a picture that's been created by Rob Hedge, who did the finds analysis, that has also done all the beautiful drawings along the way. It's a map of Paris showing all the test pits with the earliest settlement evidence, and some of sort of a selection of some of the finds. So I'll leave you with that. And just a final note to say, as I should have said at the beginning, the project is joint between a lot of organisations, but we're running it on behalf of Worcestershire Archaeological Society, and have had funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So everyone who buys National Lottery tickets, you've helped make this project happen. So thank you very much.